by this point, it's no secret that the pandemic severely stunted learning outcomes for children and teens. But COVID didn't just impact learning in the classroom, it also had a serious effect on how students behaved and interacted with one another. I'm Elena Neale-Sacks, sitting in for Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Today, I'm talking to education reporter Julia Silverman. Julia covers grades K through 12, but today we're zooming in to focus on one particular subset, middle schoolers. Specifically, why so many of them misbehaved during the pandemic and why they've continued to do so. Julia, thanks for coming back on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I admit that this is a topic that is near and dear to my own heart because I have middle school twins. So this one's personal.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that later in the conversation. So I kind of want to start actually by talking about the opening or the lead of your story. It opens with kind of this anecdote of a Portland area sixth grader, Zane, who started bringing a notebook to school to document his own bullying at the request of school staff. And that's kind of wild to me. Can you talk a bit about what Zane shared with you about his experience over the last year or 2 years?
Yeah, I can. So this is a lovely and really exceptional kid. And, it's a kid who is very much at home in his own body and really knows who he is in a way that I'm not sure that I do at 46, right? So here's a kid who showed up for the first day of school. I think I remember him telling me that like his hair was purple and he had sort of like specially curated his outfit. And he had come from a, elementary school that was an arts magnet that was a pretty loving and close environment and had always been a good student and, had a lot of a real sense of self, I would say. And he and his mom say that he has really struggled from the beginning at middle school this year. And there was, things did get so bad that eventually the school said to him, hey, you need to help us to keep track of everything that's happening. And so he, began to write down, this day somebody tripped me, or this day somebody tried to steal my phone, or, more seriously, this day somebody threatened to rape me,
Wow.
or this day, there's an incident that really stands out for him and his family, which was about a conversation around when the World Cup was happening in Qatar, and they were talking in his social studies class about the country's really horrific record on human rights violations against LGBTQIA plus people. And this is a kid who identifies as gay. And he says that one of his classmates suggested that he and others should be publicly executed just for being gay, and that's pretty serious, serious stuff.
Wow.
So it's now you use the phrase anecdote, and I think that's right. There are lots of kids at middle schools and lots of different experiences. So from this one kid, I wanted to zoom out to take a broader look at what middle schools look like around Portland this year. Last year, people who follow education in the metro area closely will remember that it wasn't an easy reentry for anybody, but we started around about October and November to hear about really disturbing incidents in middle schools. In the Reynolds School District, which is in eastern Multnomah County, one middle school just shut down for 3 weeks in last November, not because of COVID, but because, November of 2021. What is time? Just to make that clear, they shut down for 3 weeks because the behavior had gotten so bad.
Wow.
That the school administration very honestly said, we need a reset here. We need to start over and reestablish behavior expectations. Something that stands out for me, because I follow Portland Public Schools particularly closely, is that at the end in May of 2022, about almost 50 middle school teachers from around the district signed a letter to PPS and essentially said, you have got to do something. We need more help. Students and teachers deserve to feel safe in middle school. If we zoom out even further, we know, right, that discipline has always been an issue, a disproportionate issue in middle school, and it makes sense. Middle school is a weird time. Nobody likes it. Hormones are going crazy. Kids are just kind of figuring out how to transition into being adults, right?
Yeah.
And so it's always been true that middle schools are disproportionately represented when you look at the numbers of referrals to the principal's office or suspensions from school, or even worst case scenarios, expulsions. And of course, we also know that there are really disturbing patterns in discipline that suggest that Black students and Hispanic, Latino students and Native students tend to be disciplined at higher rates in school than their white and Asian peers, right? And I want to call out in particular a subset of that, which is special education students who are also, and special education students of color in particular, who are also really disproportionately represented in discipline statistics. What was different about last year, and to some extent this year in middle schools, is the intensity of the behaviors. It just seemed to really be amped up. And again, it makes sense. These are kids who were between about 9 and 11 when the pandemic lockdown started, right? And think about yourself at that age. That's the time when you should be developing some independence. Your friends are super important and influential. And instead you're like in a house with your parents looking at a screen. Yeah. And that's if you're lucky, you were able to be in a house somewhere safe with your parents, right? That's a privilege that not everybody had. So, of course, these kids had some developmental, I think, dysregulation. I could see it at my house too, and then they all went back into schools and it was a bit of a mess. So that's a long preamble. I can stop, or I can tell you how this year is going.
I was going to ask kind of what is different about this year, because as you said, middle school is kind of just notoriously, like, pandemic or no pandemic, like, it's notoriously kind of like just a rough place for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
So would you say kind of really the difference is it's just scale, like intensity?
Right. And more kids being more dysregulated and needing to relearn how to be a part of a school community.
Yeah.
And not only that, how to be a part of a school community where more adult expectations are placed on you, right? I mean, elementary schools by and large are like fuzzier, warmer places. And I'm not saying there's not lots of love in middle school too, but like that's the age when we start to expect kids to take more responsibility for their own actions and their own homework and their general behaviors, right?
Yeah.
So, and which is appropriate. You're going into high school. There's fewer people to hold your hand. We're trying to prepare kids to be adults, to be independent, to be standing on their own 2 feet.
Right.
And middle school is the bridge to that. So, yeah, I do know that from my reporting, I know that a number of districts in the Portland metro area did hear that sort of call and realized that they had under-resourced middle schools to some level last year. And many of them chose to use federal pandemic relief dollars to provide new resources and new really bodies in the building for middle schools in particular. So in my story, I spotlighted the Portland Public Schools District's decision to invest in restorative justice coordinators. 12, that's a big investment, 12 people who work on this program, and I can explain what RJ is. Is it okay if I call it RJ?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, acronym. And in addition, the district put more people whose job it is to help with like security, and by that I don't mean police. I mean people who are literally in the hallway. Sometimes just having an adult present is enough to avert a fist fight or whatever, right? And they put in some more social workers who are there to try to help not just students but families navigate their way to finding the resources they need, whether it's help with food stamps or housing assistance or even just a place to do your laundry, right? So yeah. I do think many districts made an effort to try to shore up this age group. Now, is it helping? That's the $1 zillion question.
Yeah. Obviously, I think when people first hear about this, there's this uptick in, student misbehavior, bullying, and, starting with Zane's experience, like it's kind of highlighting like quote unquote bad behavior. But then of course you also in your story talk about it's not just that, it's like there's been an increase in mental health challenges and substance abuse among middle schoolers. And I guess, could you just kind of touch on how these issues are kind of related? Because of course, bad behavior, quote unquote, does not occur in a vacuum. There's often a reason for it. It's usually kind of embroiled in many other things as well. And kind of the influence of the pandemic on all those factors.
That's such a great question. And, I just talked yesterday to Dr. Jennifer Pfeiffer, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon and works on adolescence specifically. And she pointed out that early adolescence is exactly when struggles with mental health tend to emerge for many people. And during the pandemic, particularly when school buildings were closed, there were fewer adults around to spot that might be happening for kids, right? Teachers, coaches, those are the kinds of people who are first responders, who are with a kid day in and day out, and who can see when something's wrong. And, I can unfortunately tell you from personal experience, and this is something else that Dr. Pfeiffer brought up with me, is that it was very hard to access a therapist for your child during the pandemic. Their wait lists were incredibly long. People had scaled back their practice. Without getting into too much detail and violate my own kids' privacy, I can just say that was something that we personally struggled with as well. So, I think that issue was kind of compounded when kids went back to school buildings, because there was this unaddressed kind of pent up need, right? And it all was working itself out at once. So I think that's a really good question.
Well, so because you've mentioned your own kind of kids experience a couple times, and yes, of course, you don't need to get too into detail here, but you have two kids. They're both in middle school at the moment. How old are they? What grades are they in?
They're 14-year-old twins.
Okay.
So
okay.
8th grade.
Wow. All right. And did this story for you come out of seeing their experience, or was it like, kind of just tangentially related, or which came first, I guess?
That's a good question. I think the answer to it points to, I was going to say that the answer to that question has to do with equity. But actually, in my story, I write about how, fights have broken out at even some of the district's most well-heeled middle schools, right? Like, the principal at West Sylvan Middle School, which is over on the west side and generally serves a whiter and wealthier population, recently let her school community know about a, pretty serious hate motivated fight between students, right? So this certainly isn't confined to a school that might serve a higher percentage of kids of color or families who are furthest from educational justice or living in poverty or have special education needs. I wouldn't say that I had ever heard from my kids that they felt unsafe at school, but I was certainly hearing from friends of theirs that they were feeling that way at various schools around the city. So yes, but really this story came from looking at the data.
Yeah.
I mean, just the discipline numbers are really alarming. And then I had heard, I knew that the school had, the districts were investing more money in this area, and I'm always interested in following the money any reporter is. So
for sure. I kind of want to talk a bit or get into the distinctive like approaches that various districts might be taking to this, increase in bullying and just students having a hard time in middle school right now. Because you mentioned discipline, but then you also mentioned, these kind of newer, relatively restorative justice or RJA practices. Are you seeing any patterns? Does it seem like most schools that you've looked at in Portland are kind of trying to bring more restorative justice into their approach? Or have you seen any where it's kind of more of that traditional, like, well, they're misbehaving, we're going to, send them to the principal's office, they get suspended? Like, what are you seeing in terms of those kind of different methods, I guess?
So I do think that RJ, which is also known as restorative practices, has a really broad foothold in the Portland metro area, and has for about 5 years. I think the difference now is that districts are going maybe even more all in, right? And trying to, if you have a full-time restorative justice coordinator on staff who can provide staff like training to the rest of the teachers and educators and staff members in the building, it's a more significant investment than if you just have, somebody who can get called in when things are bad, right? Who doesn't really know your school community. So one of the things that I had the chance to do for this story was to sit in over at Harriet Tubman Middle School, which is in Northeast Portland. And I got to talk with their restorative justice coordinator there, who is a terrific educator called Deborah Robinson. And she was running a workshop for students who had expressed interest in becoming interveners. Basically, we all know, because we've all been middle schoolers at one point, that teachers aren't always there. They're not there always listening in at the cafeteria or on the playground or in the hallways or after school. And so these are kids who are quite brave, actually, willing to be the ones to kind of stick their neck out, and say, hey, listen, I'm not going to try to talk like a kid. I'll sound like an idiot, but hey, this isn't cool, right? You guys need to separate or to calm down or whatever, and try to be kind of eyes and ears on the ground. And in order to be able to do that effectively and safely, it's a great idea to have some training. So when I was over at Harriet Tubman, they were running through various scenarios, right? One of my classmates has told me that he's gay, and other classmates are making fun of him, and how can I react? Or somebody is getting fat shamed in PE. Like, what are ways that, what can I say, and what can I do, and what can I draw on to be able to interrupt that behavior? This is new. It's a pilot program that was happening at Harriet Tubman, but the hope was that that can spread to other middle schools around Portland in particular.
Yeah. I actually wanted to kind of ask a follow-up to that, because that was one of the things while reading your story that kind of stood out to me, was this new kind of student, intervention mediation kind of program or practice, I guess. Because on the one hand, it definitely, seems like this innovative, potentially really effective, almost silver lining to this unfortunate uptick in students kind of acting out at school. But then I did also have the thought of is this kind of an unfair responsibility to place on students? And, what could there be backlash to them if they, speak out? And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, as a parent, as someone who's reported on this, for the last several months in Portland, at least, what do you I guess, how do you kind of view this?
Yeah, I don't think I got that. I think the kids who were in that room were all volunteers, right? Like they wanted to be there and they were ready to be there. And they were kids who had demonstrated that they were leaders in, maybe the school's Black Student Union or their Queer Straight Alliance or the school's affinity groups for Asian American Pacific Islanders or Latino kids. So they were there because they were ready. I think it's important to note that there were only 7th and 8th graders in that room. Nobody was asking 6th graders yet to do that, because you do grow up a bit in middle school. And I think what's really powerful is if you start thinking about those kids taking those skills with them into high school, right? And, one of the things that you'll often hear about restorative justice is that it is not an immediate fix. And that can feel really frustrating, especially like think about if you're Zane's mom, you want an answer right now, right? And that's a family that has had some experiences with restorative justice and found them to be really positive. And still, like you can fix one problem and have another one pop up the next day, right? But I guess you have to sort of take the long view here and think, if you get kids in a place where they are, and educators too, because sometimes the conflict is between a student and their teacher or a student and a staff member. And so the staff member too has to be willing to come to the circle and talk about what's happened and try to see what's happened from another person's perspective and understand the impact that their actions have had. And ultimately, the hope is to come to some kind of a guided resolution. And maybe that means an apology, or maybe that means, hey, you and I are oil and water, and you know what? We're just going to try to stay away from each other, or maybe that means like actual restitution. Like, I'm sorry that I'm making this up, splashed water all over the bathroom floor and I'll go clean it up. Like maybe it's that.
Right.
But, whatever it is, everybody has to be willing to be there and have the language to be there. But if you get a generation of kids that knows how to do that and teachers who know how to do it too in a culturally sensitive way, because don't forget, in most Portland area schools, most faculty members are white, and that's not necessarily true of the kids more and more in Oregon schools. These are complicated and difficult issues, but if you get a generation of people that are acquiring those abilities, it could really pay off down the line. For me, I'm interested to see whether schools will stick with this kind of an approach long term, because there is always a new problem and there's always something that demands our attention. And I could make a case for schools going all in on so many things. I could make the case that every kid who has fallen behind during the pandemic needs a one-on-one tutor, and that is where schools should spend all their money. And I could make a case that, career and technical education is what really keeps high schoolers in school, and that is where we should spend all of our money, right? So, you just have to hope, though, that people will stick with an approach and give it time to pay off.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned like teachers a little bit, and I just want to make sure we talk about them a bit too. I mean, I've never thought that being a middle school teacher is an easy job, but especially given everything we've just talked about, it sounds like having that job in the last year or two would be maybe especially difficult. And yeah, based on your conversations with middle school teachers in the Portland area, like how are they doing right now? And what are they kind of thinking and feeling about everything that's going on?
I had a fantastic conversation with a school counselor out at Centennial Middle School this morning, and I think she really summed up for me what a lot of teachers are thinking and feeling. She said there is no question it is better this year than last year, right? There are still going to be fights. There's still going to be bullying, but it is the scale and intensity has come down as people adjust to, our shared new normal.
Yeah.
And she said that and I've heard this elsewhere too, she said that one thing that has made this year better is just that there's a little bit more room for joy in schools. I was just talking to a parent of a Roseway Heights Middle School in Portland, which is a school that had a lot of trouble last year. And she was telling me how wonderful it is just to have middle school dances back. This is the first year that schools have been able to host that.
Yeah.
So these sort of markers, like the counselor at Centennial was saying how terrific it is that they have been able to hire an art teacher. And she was like, that might be what keeps some kids getting up in the morning and coming to school, that they know they have art, right? So on the other hand, she said it's still on a daily basis, it is still quite challenging because kids have been through trauma. And she essentially said, we still need more bodies. We still need more people who are here to listen and guide and, hold kids' hands as they move out of the sort of shared trauma of COVID and into whatever comes next.
Yeah. A lot of these kind of strategies that schools seem to be implementing, like you said, are kind of long-term, bigger picture changes that, maybe have been due for a long time. But in the short term, with Zane as an example, for students who are experiencing, bullying repeatedly on a day-to-day basis, what support exists right now?
That's such a hard question. I think it depends on where you go to school and what kind of culture that school has created. And, I know that Zane is a student who is trying to transfer to a different school, has maybe just concluded that where he's at is not an environment where he can thrive and flourish. And in fact, his family is even trying to figure out if they should leave the public school system entirely,
Wow.
which is really hard because so many people want to be invested in their city and their neighborhood and the school system.
Yeah.
So, it really just depends on a school. And it's kind of like the counselor out at Centennial said, there are more adults in the building now and things are more stable and it's all still a work in progress.
Yeah. Well, I think those were all my questions. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on or that you hope readers take away from your story?
Oh, thank you for that question. I guess I'd say I hope people will get in touch. I try really hard to have the voices of parents and students in my stories, and teachers too. We can always reach an administrator. We can always reach a spokesperson, but it really matters to me, and I would really love to hear from people who might want to let me know how their school year is going and what I should write about next.
Well, Julia, thanks for your reporting and for coming on the show to talk about it. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was good fun.
Well, thank you for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you haven't read Julia's latest story, I highly recommend it. You can find a link in the episode notes. And as always, if you like the show, we wouldn't say no to a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.